So I'm John. I'm a customer engineer team lead on Looker's team out of New York, the East Coast team. And I'm here today to share some of what I've learned from being involved in literally hundreds of business intelligence evaluations over the last couple of years. I have kind of seen all of the possible configurations. Before Looker, I worked with Accenture. And so, with my Fortune 100 clients, I saw everything from Oracle, BI to Cognos to working myself with Tableau and a few other tools before joining Looker. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I've learned about how the field has kind of evolved and changed over the years, and also how our criteria for evaluating the right BI tool for the job should also change. So first thing, what we're going to cover today is first, how has business intelligence evolved over the last decade or so? Second, why is the old playbook for evaluating the right tool for the job a little bit outdated? And third, and finally, how do you modernize your strategy? And we'll include some actionable tips that you can kind of take advantage of right away. And just a keynote before we begin, obviously we at Looker have a lot of experience running, solving customer data problems with our own platform. We think we've developed something pretty great and flexible. But the focus of this talk is not how great Looker is. Feel free to chat questions in the Q&A about Looker specifically. I'm happy to help with those too. But today we're going to focus on kind of vendor agnostic best practices for running evaluations, whatever tool you end up going with in the end. All right, so first things first, let's talk about how BI has evolved since its inception. In the beginning, I got to start with in the beginning, formal BI practices kind of evolved in the days when companies either had no way to report on key metrics, or they were using kind of fragmented spreadsheets and siloed processes to run their business. In those days, BI was really focused on eliminating silos with a heavy emphasis on centralization through governance, control, and consistency, and an enterprise data warehouse. Over time, that has kind of changed because, unfortunately, the downside of that approach is a handful of people become the gatekeepers for data. And as data has ballooned and more teams have needed it to do their jobs, the pendulum has swung in the other direction towards more self-service, more kind of business user-friendly tools. And now companies are relying on data for basically every decision that they make, and it's becoming a really important part of their product portfolio that they need to monetize. So we need to kind of walk a tightrope between those two competing demands. One is governance and consistency, and the other being accessibility and self-service. So we'll talk a little bit about how that's changed since the past. So let's talk about traditional characteristics of BI first before we launch into what's new. So first things first, right? BI is not a new thing. It's been around for decades, and organizations have turned to it to make sense of their internal systems. Back in the day, it was really focused on ERP specifically, but that's changed as new data sources have become accessible and instrumental to people's businesses. So let's talk about how these origins have shaped the way companies have traditionally thought about BI. So specifically, in the old days, the BI tools of the past were really dependent on ETL and enterprise data warehouse development by the IT org. They typically followed a build out the warehouse first, and then we'll figure out the reporting when it's done approach. That may have worked when the only source of data was from an ERP system, but it's not feasible today as companies have potentially hundreds of different SaaS data sources that they're relying on, and they need to be able to kind of build and iterate on that reporting as they add to their stack. The next thing that kind of was a characteristic of old BI was that the output of reporting was really heavily focused on pixel perfect reports. So think things like auditing and financial reporting, where every graph and chart had to be just so, and things were largely static. So we had the same report format every single time, and we tried our best to kind of predict what the end user needed to see, because some IT developer on the back end was going to have to make it for them. This, unfortunately, is not working today, because we see more and more business professionals who need to be able to access and interact with and iterate on data themselves. They have the topic knowledge. They just need to be able to access that data. So this is kind of another shift from the past. And because of some of these trends that we've talked about up front, like the long development life cycle, the need for pixel perfect reporting and IT-driven development, we've seen historically poor adoption across the business because these tools simply weren't designed with end users in mind. Of course, this one is a really common thing to hear people lament about today, but in the past, most reporting was focused on the question of what happened, and data from yesterday or the week before or the last year to date, and not because of technical limitations, not focused on real-time reporting, what's happening right now, or predictive analytics, what's going to happen in the future. But as you all know, the shift to the cloud and more accessible technology is really rapidly changing that. And then last but not least, kind of going hand in hand with pixel perfect reporting and that reactivity, the main focus of old school BI was kind of designing for distribution of static reports. So sending things out to different inboxes, delivering it to specific portals in like an export or CSV format. And unfortunately, the problem with that report distribution model is it's not interactive, it's not user friendly, and a lot of the times like that delivered data just like languished in whatever destination it was sent to. So let's talk now how things are changing as we shift to more modern BI. So rather than the previous slide, we're seeing BI today that is much more driven by the business. It's tied to business outcomes and tangible ROI. And this is going to be something you'll hear more about in this presentation later on. It's also focused more on data exploration and self-service. So the ability for users to self-serve and kind of answer questions at the speed and pace of a global business has become increasingly more important. We are seeing a shift where today's modern platforms are focusing on all user types, not just a subset of like power users who really understand that specific syntax for that function, or coders who are able to build things with Python or JavaScript. But rather, you could have view-only users over here. You could have power users who are not coders but need to be able to iterate and answer their own questions and explore. And then, of course, there's also you're gonna have your conventional data engineering, data analyst types who are familiar and comfortable with coding as well. And then, of course, going back to that reactive on the last slide, we're shifting much more with more computing power and more kind of diffusion of AI and ML into the business. We're seeing many more use cases that are proactive, answering the question of what's happening right now, or even predictive, what will likely happen tomorrow. Last but not least, we're opening the lens from the scope of traditionally just dashboards and reporting to new use cases, thinking things like collaboration across the spectrum, so specific use cases for your data science team, and then different use cases for your customers. Think things like embedding and productizing analytics as part of a product offering. Really amazing examples and innovation happening in the space right now. So the market has changed in a pretty meaningful way, but many organizations are still stuck in the past using old criteria to pick a platform. Let's talk about why that's not working. So there are some specific things about the old approach that just kind of don't work in today's environment. The first is because we were kind of comparing between these monolithic platforms that had been around for decades and kind of were the gatekeepers for data, many people took the approach that we need to basically do a checkbox for each feature, right? We're going to create a spreadsheet, RFP, and we're going to look at which platform checks the most boxes. This really doesn't work today because of the diversity of use cases that we talked about on the last slide. So as people start to do more things with BI, just focusing on like blanket features really doesn't necessarily move the needle when we're talking about business value. Instead, it's more important to understand specifically what's the change in the bottom line you're trying to engineer and work backward from that, which tool serves that need the best. Another kind of challenge here is in the old days, it wasn't really practical to interact with row level data because the warehouse was expensive and inaccessible because it took so long to stand up these data platforms. And so there was a heavy reliance on data pre-aggregation. Basically, the IT team saying, we are going to predict the range of possible questions, and we're going to roll up the data to the right level to make it performant so that we can spit out these report factory reports. And that is just not the way that folks think today. They want to be able to see the trends across the business of how things are trending across different customers and segments and geographies, but they also want to be able to drill down. And I think a kind of the level of data literacy has really risen amongst business users such that they are demanding access to individual kind of row level data and the ability to ask iterative questions, not just be limited by what was pre-aggregated. And then next, we're moving far beyond just like basic reporting requirements. We talked about this a little bit already. Traditional evaluation processes centered around the end goal of kind of creating and distributing highly formatted reports, but they're ignoring more impactful and engaging methods of delivery, like embedded content, automation of workflows, or proactive alerts delivered to business users' favorite, chat environment, for example. And last but not least, the technical complexity has gone way up. There's much more, many legacy tools used to take like 6+ months just to stand up. But now you're dealing with all different kinds of kind of cloud-based services, AI and ML in the stack, data science use cases. The corresponding thing to this is while, companies are doing more with data, tools have become much, much simpler to stand up in a short period of time. So it used to be, standing up Oracle BI, it would take 6+ months to get the tool integrated. It wasn't really practical to try out on real life data. Today, it's literally minutes from connecting to your database to getting reports and dashboards. So the need to evaluate in a real world context has become much more feasible to address. So let's talk about what the more modern approach that's emerging that we see looks like. So basically what we're looking at here is a shift from the old ways of the kind of RFP-based approach we just talked about to an emerging new set of modern requirements. And I'm not going to kind of like drain this slide necessarily, but it's going to be a lot of what you'd expect. So for example, shifting from that paradigm of governing and controlling and restricting access to data to a balance between governance and also opening it up to the rest of the business for the sake of business-driven innovation. Things like moving from pixel-perfect reports to iterative exploration of trusted definitions. Shifting from that report factory that we all know and love to new use cases beyond just dashboards, right? Data experiences, we talk a lot about that at Looker, but building bespoke experiences for different audiences. Moving from a single centralized enterprise data warehouse that's fully manicured to access to diverse real-time data sources, potentially still centralized in a warehouse, but oftentimes with like real-time ETL or not necessarily quite so prepped data, maybe transforming it with a tool like dbt in database as like a next step after preliminary exploration. And then last but not least, moving from a model where all of your data is extracted into a third-party environment and you're locked in with whatever you build on that platform, basically gone when you move off that platform, to something that's much more friendly to open source, extensible to other tools in the data stack. As more people have gotten involved, it's been much more important to be able to export data and extract it to wherever you need for all of these variety of different use cases and audiences. And that's just kind of shifting the mindset from traditional BI and reporting to new methods of reporting. There's also new use cases that are being explored by companies around the board. And so we think you should kind of keep your eye on 3 key areas. The first is integrating insights into applications, portals, and platforms where people are already working. This could be in terms of your internal team putting insights directly in Salesforce where the sales team is particularly prone to hang out. Or it could be externally with vendors or other collaborators that are outside of your organization. The second area is more data-driven workflow, so infusing data to automate decisions based on thresholds or augment human decision-making with kind of upcoming alerts in real time or without human intervention entirely. And then the last piece is building completely custom experiences and really productizing analytics out to customers. This has become a huge part of our business at Looker. And we've seen kind of, just from the fact that everyone has a smartphone in their pocket that has analytics on their usage of different apps or their health or how many steps they took in a day, people are increasingly demanding that of every tool, especially on the business side that they use. Why isn't it as easy as that? And so with this shift in scope and the shift in criteria, there's also got to be a shift in who's involved. So it used to be this was really IT's ball game, but now we advise people to involve stakeholders across the spectrum. So everyone from executive sponsors who are really concerned with kind of the decision-making purview and process and how this impacts the strategy overall, to your traditional data engineers and stewards, folks who used to be responsible for the back-end processes of transforming and maintaining the warehouse, to data analysts who are responsible for creating those new environments and experiences and reports for the actual business units downstream. And this is like really where things change. We like to run trials that involve the actual end users themselves. So if you're working with product team or marketing team or finance people, actually get them in the tool during the evaluation period in order to kind of understand how they're going to use it in real life. And again, take that approach of future-proofing this so that we don't just figure this all out in the walled garden of the IT department and then push it down to the business. And then last but not least, IT should definitely still be involved, especially when it comes to maintaining infrastructure, if this needs to be self-hosted, for example, or managing integrations, all kinds of things like that. But they're certainly not the only person who has a stake in this. And so the new modern evaluation really takes that holistic approach involving more folks. The other thing is, as we all know, data is growing exponentially. the data that might be relevant to your business today may be only a small part of the picture tomorrow. And so it's really important to try to future-proof your evaluation, specifically with regard to 3 key areas. So here are some questions that you can ask to make sure that when you evaluate a BI tool this year, you're not going to have to just do the same thing again in the next 2 years as the market evolves and your strategy changes. So the first section is around changing data strategy. Ask questions ahead of your evaluation about what's going to happen if you need to move to a new approach or collect new types of data. Will your analytics platform be able to evolve along with that, or is it going to dictate what you can store and analyze effectively? Same with platform extensibility. Can the platform integrate capabilities from other vendors, and can it deliver data into those external products to augment the offering? And then last but not least, one thing you can bet on in life is increased data volume and complexity. So does the platform meet your current performance requirements against like a real life volume of data? And does it also have the flexibility to adapt as users mature and demand more and your data volumes expand over time? And I think another important element to this is not just can it happen technically, but also what is the sort of monetization and the scalability from the vendor's perspective as that happens? Because if you're going to have to if you're going to have to negotiate storage on their side, there's going to be a whole conversation around, exponential data volume growth means exponentially increasing price. So one thing to keep in mind before you dive in. So as promised, I did want to kind of make this a little bit more proactive and actionable. There's a few things that you can start doing now to make sure that when you do come up against an evaluation of BI, you're ready to roll and everything kind of moves smoothly. The first and most important thing is rather than focusing on features and focusing on checking all the boxes of, does it do a pie chart? Does it do a bar chart, right? Every tool out there can do that today. Instead, focus on identifying a real business value that's tied to your company's top line strategy. So are we trying to open up new revenue streams and productize data? Are we trying to decrease developer time so we can free it up for this really valuable, NLP use case down the line? Figure out what that thing is. It should fall into one of 3 categories, either increasing revenue, decreasing costs, and mitigating risks. This is like your vision for the whole evaluation process, and it'll drive your criteria and your selection downstream. Other things you can do today, leverage industry research from places like Gartner or IDC to kind of understand the players out there. Talk to customer references. So once you've kind of identified a short list, focus on talking to people who have evaluated those tools in the past from your professional network. Understand what questions they asked at the time and what they wish they had asked, knowing then what they knew now. Structure your evaluation. So figure out kind of like a particular scope and project plan for this decision. Make sure that you have time with the various stakeholders. Obviously, as the scope widens, the coordination effort becomes more important. So we always recommend having like a single point of contact who's in charge of QBing this whole effort. And then last but not least, try to conduct a future-proofed evaluation with at least 2 different options. And when I say 2 options, I don't mean, 2 identical tools from different competitors, right? Understand the difference in architecture, how they interact with your data, and the capabilities in terms of what the tool can do for end users. And try to pick 2 options that are pretty differentiated, right? It could be a cube-based tool and a direct-to-database tool. It could be a workbook-based tool and a direct query analyst tool. But pick things that aren't the same so you can see at least a couple of different approaches to this very kind of many-sided problem. And last but not least, if you want to learn more, you're in luck. We actually published a paper on how to evaluate BI in a modern context with all these new use cases and complexity that's come up end of last year-ish. So feel free to go look that up. And if you have questions, your Looker team can definitely speak to this and help you kind of understand how to think about this in advance so that when you get there, you're ready to make an informed decision.